Welcome to the Jeffco DeAngelis Foundation podcast series focusing on school safety and security. My name is Kevin Carroll, Executive Director for the Foundation. Throughout this series, we will be engaging in informative conversations with local, national, and even internationally recognized experts in the arena of school and community safety. We will be exploring best practices in crisis preparation, response, and recovery, as well as gleaning lessons learned from these remarkable professionals. In today's broadcast, we have the great pleasure of learning more from the insights of Dr. John Nicoletti, esteemed police and public safety psychologist. The Jeffco DeAngelis Foundation originated in Jefferson County, Colorado, with a deep passion for and a relentless commitment to sharing best practices in school safety and security with first responders, as well as school and school district personnel. We, in partnership with Jefferson County Public Schools, support a one-of-a-kind training facility, the Frank DeAngelis Center for Community Safety. This former elementary school is now a premier training facility which has supported training for over 7,200 first responders. Our trainings encompass everything from the practical to the tactical, focusing on proven approaches to preparedness, response, and recovery. More can be learned about the training facility, our team of nationally recognized trainers, and the Foundation by visiting deangeliscenter.org. And with that, it's my true pleasure to welcome our special guest today, Dr. John Nicoletti. John is partner with Nicoletti Flatter Associates, specializing in police and public safety psychology, crisis intervention, and violence prevention. Welcome, Dr. Nicoletti.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Also with us today is Mr. John McDonald, Executive Director of School Safety for Jefferson County Public Schools. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm looking forward to delving into the life of Dr. Nicoletti.
There you go. I am as well. Dr. Nicoletti, we're going to start by having you talk with us a little bit, share with our listeners about your background and how you came into this important work.
Okay, well, I got my doctorate degree from Colorado State University. Then when I graduated, I started working actually here in Jefferson County with the Jefferson County Mental Health Center. And started just doing outreach, actually started with the Arvada Police Department, going over there and working with the officers and providing training. Always been around cops. My brother was a cop and he headed up the crime lab for Denver. So I just started working with different agencies, and this was before police psychology had gained a foothold in the field. So started doing that, and then I had the opportunity, I got invited to train at the FBI Academy with some of the early profilers, the Silence of the Lambs guys. So I got to learn some really interesting stuff back then. Oh. And then being in Jeffco, my early intervention with threats and trauma was not so much in the school, but we had a shooting at Albertsons over on Kipling, and that's, I responded to that.
Down in Littleton? That one? Okay.
Yeah. The shooter was an individual by the name Petrowski and actually killed a Jeffco deputy, and so it was a real tragic type event. Then I responded to Chuck E. Cheese, which was an event in Aurora. Those all happened before Columbine.
So it sounds like the concept of a more formalized police psychology field, you were at the front end of that, especially here in Colorado, and it's just developed from there.
Yeah, it's developed now. It's actually a standardized segment of the Board of Professional Psychology that we got that accepted in about 2010 or 11.
Okay, wow. So much of your work and much of our work as a foundation is in support of schools and school districts and first responders preparing for, responding to, and recovering from acts of school violence. For purposes of the background for our listeners, can you mention a few of the school events that you and your team have been a part of responding to?
Well, obviously the first one was Columbine in April of 1999. And then, responded throughout the years to the different ones in the area, like got called in after the Arapahoe High School shooting to do an investigation of what happened there, and responded to the STEM shooting and also the Platte Canyon shooting, and off and on throughout the state, smaller incidences.
And then that's led to supporting folks across the country and even across the world related to school violence, yeah?
Yes, yeah. And wrote a book called Violence Goes to School and wrote one called Violence Goes to College.
So, John, you are a big part of supporting Jeffco Schools itself, and we have had our own issues around school shootings. Columbine, John had mentioned, Dr. Nicoletti had mentioned. That's often in people's minds thought of as the first school shooting Can you clarify that myth for us a little bit?
It certainly wasn't. I mean, just the year prior to Columbine, Paducah, Kentucky, Jonesboro, Arkansas, Pearl, Mississippi, Springfield, Oregon. So while, they all came before and were devastating, Columbine has certainly, I think, become known as the modern day. I don't know what you want to call it. I don't want to call it standard, but it's certainly been the point of all focus for all these years. So, we've worked with Dr. Nicoletti through the school district on so many events and tragedies, including the Jessica Ridgeway tragedy, which we've talked about with Sergeant Tim Reed, and Deer Creek Middle School shooting tragedy that we went through, and he's just for us, he's on speed dial. He's a constant resource, and I know he is for school districts all over the state and the country.
I know one of the big things that we talk about as a foundation is the importance of the partnership between school districts and first responders. And Columbine was one of those times when we learned about the importance of a well-coordinated, thought-through response, not just response, but also recovery then too, right? What do we do after? I know your work, Dr. Nicoletti, talks about all of those different phases, the preparation piece. We're going to talk a little bit about threat assessment today, the response, the implications for a community around that response phase, and then the recovery phase. So we're going to get into all those things and bring up Columbine because it does stand as one of those pieces in people's minds where they say that was the first one, right? And really it's not. It's the first one that was so widely publicized, right? And that happens now too. When these events happen around the country and around the world, the cameras are on it, and that's a whole part of the response that we need to be thoughtful about too. And I would imagine some of the trauma that a community has to respond to comes from seeing things over and over and over again too, and the misperceptions that may come out of that. Would you talk a little bit, Dr. Nicoletti, about one of what I know is the major areas that your group works on, and this is the threat assessment and threat management process. Obviously, there's not time in our broadcast today to go into all of the elements of a comprehensive threat management system, but can you hit on some of the key core elements of a quality, effective threat management system, and maybe some of the misperceptions or missteps, misbeliefs that are out there about the threat assessment process?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back in time, going back to the shootings prior to Columbine, one of the things we did when we wrote the book Violence Goes This, we tried to do an algorithm of all the different shootings and look at, okay, what were some of the characteristics that were present, and then carry that forward. And some of the things we started seeing that were present in all of them is all attackers, and I could use all pretty close to that, broadcast before they engaged in the attack behavior. And what was happening in a lot of the school districts is the attackers were broadcasting, and a couple things, people didn't believe it. So one of the things we talk about in threat assessment, if somebody broadcasts it, you all need to believe it. Because if you don't believe it, you're becoming a tea leaf reader, and you better be good at that from that standpoint. So we had people not believing the broadcast. And then we had stovepiping where, say, the PE teacher heard it, and then a counselor heard it, and police officer heard it, but none of them talked to each other. So it was a series of isolated incidents. So one of the first concepts of threat assessment is getting the threat team together, which we call the vortex. That way you don't have a data gap. So all the people who are, they're at different levels. There are detectors and disruptors, and then there are disruptors. So detectors are the folks who are going to be picking up the intel, usually students, things like that. Then you have detectors and disruptors, and that would be people who pick it up, but they also have authority, so they have a responsibility to take action. So that would be teachers, coaches, bus drivers, those type of things. It's important for them to disrupt the behavior. Then you have what's called the disruptors, and that's a concept of the threat assessment team. Threat assessment team are made up of the key players. Their job is to take action once they get the intel. Now, they're dependent on the detectors, because if the intel doesn't make it to the disruptors, then it's never going to be done.
When you talk about broadcasting, what are some of the different ways that you've experienced people broadcasting, tools they use?
Well, we looked at it and developed a coding system where we look at the broadcast will be kind of in three areas. One would be direct threats, another would be veiled threats, and a third would be conditional threats. That's one of the major categories. Direct threats, those are slam dunks. Those are where I'm going to come and shoot the school tomorrow. Unfortunately, only what we found is only about 15% of the attackers will use direct threats. So that means the majority of them are going to be using either veiled or conditional. Now, veiled threats are interesting, and you can pick it up two different ways. You can pick it up using the brain, the cognitive part, or you can use it with your gut. So veiled threats are statements that cause people to think, what do they mean? So if you have yourself ever thinking, what does that person mean? That's a veiled threat. It would be things like, probably don't want to be at school tomorrow. I don't get mad, I get even. You're going to regret what you did to me. Those are things, well, what do they mean by that?
So talking around the edges of it.
Edges of
right?
it, yeah.
Saying enough to say I'm saying something, but not enough to have somebody say, oh, you shouldn't say that. Right?
Yeah, and it's unfortunately not enough that law enforcement can do anything. It's not like a direct threat where they can take it. So a lot of times in some states, the police department says, well, we can't do anything. Then the other are conditional threats. And those are easy to pick up. They're compound sentences. And you listen for two words in the sentence structure or in the writings and stuff. One word is the word if, the other word is the word or. Arapahoe High School shooting. If you kick me off the debate team, I will come back and kill you. So that's a compound sentence, the if part combined with a direct threat. I will come back and kill you. It could be a veiled threat. If you break up with me or if you fail me, you're going to regret it. So that's a compound.
I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to kill you. They use different tools, right? So social media, direct comments, writings, drawings. What other kinds of things should we be watching for?
Well, you brought up a good point. In this day and age, a high percentage, 80% plus, will broadcast in social media. And the difficulty is there's so many different social media platforms. And you don't have people who necessarily have the skill sets to review them all, but that's such a key component of data mining is the social media.
One of the things I've heard, another word that's important besides if, right, or is the word just. When you talk about when somebody's broadcasting, we should believe them, right? Oftentimes I think some of those people who are in those stovepipes who may have a relationship with a kid maybe say, well, they're just mad or they just had a bad day or they, talk about that word just a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, words activate different parts of the brain. So when you have the word just, it activates a part of the brain that will cause you to minimize danger. Just joking, just having a bad day, just a slip of the tongue. And so people are minimizing it. So that's one of the excellent points you make. That's one of the concerning things we have is if we see a school district or an individual using the word just. And we always say, just joking. How do you know they were joking? You don't know they were joking. Yeah, so that's a key word that we look at. Another one that we look at, we had a case here in Jeffco that Jeffco swooped down on. This usually comes from, a source of data are mental health counselors and providers. They'll be hearing things and stuff. So we had a case where the individual was talking about wanting to engage in, an assault. And the therapist was saying, well, he's just fantasizing. So that's another key word. Change the word fantasy to planning. And what does that do to your thought process?
Totally changes.
Yeah. And if you combine just with fantasizing, it really minimizes it. So that's another way to kind of see, okay, are these folks going to have a problem or not by how many disruptors they have in their own brain to minimize the danger.
And that's why the interdisciplinary threat assessment team is so critical, that you have a group of people from different backgrounds that can actually look at the issue, look at the problem, and then address it as a team versus having one person review and make all decisions.
Frank DeAngelis, the former principal of Columbine, and I, we were principals together, and we would often talk, we do still often talk about, boy, we wish we didn't have to have conversations like this. We wish there wasn't a need for a training center like we have. We wish there wasn't a need for all the extensive training we do. I think the broader community has the same hope that we do, that we'll get a handle on this and school shootings will become a thing of the past. I know people would hope that folks like yourself and all the work that you do with the FBI and other agencies, that we would be able to come up with some type of a profile. Everybody wants that perfect profile, but my understanding is that it's not an easy thing. There's no specific profile that works all the time, which is why such a process matters.
Yeah, and profiling gets overused. I mean, we do profiling. Like if you have a serial murderer, a serial rapist, you can do profiling. But, you know, when I first got involved in this, they wanted me, this was when there was postal shootings, and they wanted me to do a profile of the postal shooter. And the only characteristic I could come up with is male. How helpful is that? That's not. So that's the only profile characteristic we have. And that's changing too, because we're starting to see more females get involved in these attack behaviors. So you don't do a profile, and the district shouldn't be looking at that. You do a behavioral spectrum or behavioral analysis. So you look at the behavior over time, not rather than male, female, or.
Yeah, I know that's oftentimes a misperception, the male-female piece, and age too. That sometimes people go, it's just college kids or high school kids, and more we're seeing younger kids, right, John?
Our age, we have more fourth grade threat assessments than we do 10th and 11th grade threat assessments. So we are seeing in the last decade the age drop dramatically in terms of the average age of a student when they are making these really significant and scary threats.
Yeah. So talk a little bit, Dr. Nicoletti, about, I want to go back to that word just again, and for those people who are operating in stovepipes and or don't believe that their view is valuable in the threat assessment process, right? So I'm just a teacher. I'm not a school psychologist. I'm just a custodian. What would I have to say about these things? Talk a little bit more about the importance of those multiple viewpoints.
Well, you got two things. First of all, you need the multiple viewpoints. Then you need to have a inclusive meeting where they feel valuable. And so that comes from the leader of the meeting. If the leader kind of minimizes somebody, where you're just security, that's going to cause that person to feel inhibited. So you got to invite them to talk about it, and you got to say, no, you have information, and kind of really pick on that.
Yeah, I even know some fellow principals that I worked with who would say, it's the school psychologist who understands that kind of stuff better than I do. I learned about how to teach math or physics. I don't know about these mental health things. That's why I have them as an expert. So they need to be the one where really it needs to be a full look. Talk about the role of parents in that process too.
Well, I'll just say, I guess two things really come to mind. One of the reasons people are so uncomfortable in threat assessment is by its mere nature, it's sometimes confrontational. You're directly sitting across from somebody that is engaged in, proactive or reactive attack behavior, and you're having a conversation addressing and getting them to try and confess what they did, why they did it, what they meant by it. And it's an uncomfortable position for people to be in. So, some people do really well at it and others don't. And it's important to understand, as Dr. Nicoletti says, that your information, your intel that you're bringing to the table is critically important for all of us to make good decisions and how we're going to either mitigate the behavior, stop the threat, protect the school. Parents are so important to this process. We really rely on the parents to be part of our threat assessment process, and we learned that from Dr. Nicoletti. It's not enough just to sit down across from a student, because the parents involved in their lives have a big part in what happens in the future and what's been happening in the past. So our threat assessment process does not move forward without the parent involvement. If the parents say, we're not doing this, then you know what? We will go forward with as far as we can, and we'll have to make decisions without you. But we want the parents there as a partner in that decision-making process, and also we need to hear from them because they provide critical intel too. And typically what we get from parents is, thank you, because we didn't know where else to go. We didn't have anyone else to turn to. No one was helping us. And the threat assessment team is not just making decisions about what's going to happen surrounding that student's educational career. We're making decisions about where do we get you help.
Right.
Where's
So
the hope? Where's the help?
it's oftentimes the doorway to some support. It doesn't always wind up that, boy, that we have this student who is a tremendous threat, but it sometimes gets to the place where this student has some needs. We need to
Absolutely.
get some support surrounding them.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, what John brings up, excellent points. I think the other thing we see with parents is sometimes they can create some problems because, as a parent, you want to protect your child and you can't accept that they're going to harm somebody or harm themselves. So they get into what's called denial. Just because, that my kid couldn't possibly do that, then what happens is if the parent is in denial, they inadvertently, not that they want to, become an enabler. They allow the child to keep getting. So in these meetings, you're trying to kind of get through to that and talk about, like what John said, hey, we're trying to help your kid, we're trying to prevent these type of things from that standpoint.
That's where we hear that word just again, right? They're just frustrated. We've tried different things. They feel picked on.
Yeah.
What do you want them to do? You need to give us more help. What'd the other kid do? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there's so much we could talk about with the
There's
threat
one-
assessment process. I wanted to talk about in older systems that I've seen, there's a more formalized kind of numbering system, and people get hung up on different numbers. But I understand that you have looked more at the types of descriptive language we should use for a student's behavior.
Yeah, one of the things we see, there's certain words that are these magical words, like some systems, and again, I don't mean to be disrespectful, will do low, medium, and high risk. And you say, okay, behavioralize low, and behavioralize medium and stuff, and there's no real foundation for it. And the other thing we see, like in terms of deciding to breach confidentiality, it's this urban legend, and it's a word called imminent. And you'll have people saying, well, we can't give you that information unless there's an imminent threat. And then you try and say, okay, tell me your definition of imminent. And then they say, well, right away. And you say, what does right away mean? Well, it means soon. What does soon mean? It means imminent. And they're in this
Goes in a
circular-
circle.
Yeah, it's like, so that's one of the major words that interfere with getting data. Well, I can't tell you because it's not imminent. There's actually a court case, and a lot of people know about this case, but they don't read it all the way through. It's called Tarasov. It's a case that occurs in the late 60s where this treating physician is seeing an individual who's obsessed with a young lady by the name of Tatiana. And he tells the therapist that he wants to kill her. The therapist didn't think there was an imminent threat, and he does kill her. Then the family sues the provider, and the family wins. So here's your definition of imminent if you want to hold on to. How long after the individual said he wants to kill Tatiana did it take him to kill Tatiana? And the answer is 67 days. So that's your definition of imminent. So that goes back to if they broadcast it, you better believe it.
Yeah. So from our conversation today, I'm left with a couple of important highlights. One, have a process. Two, believe those broadcasts, watch for them. Do some things to avoid that stovepiping. Have the conversation, right? Think about supports that need to be put in place. Are there other missteps or misperceptions that either of you have seen as schools or districts try to put together a good threat assessment process?
Yeah, there's one I'd like to say because this is becoming even more problematic. Whenever you hear about a school shooter and you read about them, somewhere in the article they'll talk about the individual's mentally ill or schizophrenic or on the autism spectrum and stuff like that. And so what we're seeing now is a witch hunt against mentally ill people. If you, oh my God, so-and-so has PTSD, well, they're going to shoot. No, they're not. When we do our assessment, we don't even look at the diagnosis because one of the algorithms we did was we looked at all the shootings, looked at what their diagnosis was, then we tried to see if any of the diagnosis had a higher probability of an attack behavior, and we didn't. find that. So basically, that's not a predictive variable. Certainly, you want to get an individual who's struggling with a mental health issue, you want to get them help. But that doesn't create, I mean, if you look at, you say, okay, people who have this diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenic, you've got to look at the whole conglomerate of folks who are paranoid schizophrenic, and what percentage of them become violent? Very small. So that's why we don't use that as a variable. But can't tell you how many times when I go into threat assessment, not in Jeffco's district, but other places, well, what's a person's diagnosis? I'll say, I don't know. It's not.
What's their behavior? Let's start
what's
there,
their
right?
behavior? Yeah, exactly. So that's a key thing. Don't rely on the diagnosis for threat assessment. You can do it for treatment, but not threat assessment.
And one of the things I've learned from you over the years that was hard to wrap my head around at first was that if you have a threat assessment process and if you have a good threat management process, you should never have a threat reach the conclusion of an actual shooting, because you're engaging in the process early enough to stop and make an impact. And where we so often fail in the educational systems in terms of school violence is we think we're done, right? We did a threat assessment, so we're done. Just because you did a threat assessment process does not mean you're done. This is, you've got to pay attention for years.
Yeah, so that's
to
the threat management part
Correct.
of it, right? It's not just saying there is a threat, it's the so what.
Yeah.
Now what
Now
are we gonna
what?
do?
Right.
Yeah.
And they go together. You can't do one without the other.
Right. Yeah.
And oftentimes we have that piece where, let's say a threat assessment is done, and there is a level of concern that says maybe the student can't be attending their regular school at this point in time. Then where are they? How do we keep track of them and tabs on them to make sure they're getting the support they need, and that the level of threat is decreasing instead of increasing while they're not sitting in front of us
It's
in a
one of the
classroom?
reasons we created our case management process in Jeffco, based on the lessons learned from Dr. Nicoletti, based on our own events that we continue to see. So our case managers and the threat management team now follow up with students, and it's not just one and done. It's a continual follow-up process, sometimes for years after they leave.
Yeah, I was going to say, not even just when they graduate
Right.
from high school, right? And we go, okay, now we take a breath. We're all part of the same community,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. And we've sat on threat assessments with law enforcement agencies where there was a nexus at one point to the school district, and now it's a community issue, and they want our intel just like we want them to be a partner with us when it's a school type of event.
Again, still looking at things from a 360 kind
Yeah.
of perspective.
Yeah, one of the most effective countermeasures is a knock and talk. And it can come from law enforcement, because when you do a knock and talk, you let the person know, hey, you're on our radar, checking in and stuff. And it doesn't have to be law enforcement. Like, I met with some of John's folks at a Starbucks at a kid that had graduated and just checking in with them and stuff.
And that was a spooky guy.
That was a real spooky.
So it was good that we followed up.
It was really
Yeah.
good.
And certainly, John, different school districts have different structures. You talked about your kind of team a little bit. I do know that you have a multi-layered system, that schools are expected to have a local threat assessment kind of team who are closest to the kid and the family. And then based upon that assessment may raise it to what's called a district level threat assessment, where we bring in other supports and agencies and escalate it, resources. So it's important that schools and school districts think about what their process is, and that it's thorough, that they're working with their local law enforcement and also their local mental health agencies to have a full picture.
You can't. I always go back to, you can't have a safe school environment unless you put the effort in, and you can't have quality education in the school unless every child feels safe. So when somebody makes a threat, you've got to address it immediately, because one person can control the outcome of a school year based on their behavior and the concern and fear and intimidation that everyone else is feeling, and that's never okay.
Yeah, Folly, one thing I'd like to hit on, because the other thing we'll see, it's kind of like an elephant in the room, when there's a recent school shooting, you'll have this group of people saying, we're still not doing anything. We can't prevent this. The reality is, and this is the tough part, you cannot, when you have a concerning behavior and you do a countermeasure and intervention, and that behavior doesn't escalate, was that an effective intervention or was it not going to occur? So school districts can't, broadcast the success cases. I know Jeffco's had many threat assessments where there were concerning behaviors, but none of them turned into attack behavior. So you only hear about the negatives of what we call the false negatives where you missed one.
Yeah.
There's tons of false positives. So I think school districts, you don't want to give up on what you're doing.
Hard to measure prevention, right? How do we measure something that didn't happen?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's that we had that intervention and nothing occurred after that. And then you're right. What do we assume? Would it otherwise have gone there or not?
And how can you, broadcast that?
Right.
Jeffco's not going to say, hey, if you're thinking of coming here, just want to let you know we had 2,800 threats made, but nobody got killed. Who's going to want to come to your district?
It's a great marketing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's shift to that broader community now. We've talked about some school things. You've been brought in to work with first responders during and following several mass tragedies outside of schools. The Aurora movie theater comes to mind, Navy Shipyard, Pulse nightclub, most recently the riots that we're seeing. The pressure that law enforcement is under is immense. How do you help become a sense maker during life-defining tragic moments?
Well, I think, there's several things we look at, with the agencies we work with. One of the things we try and do ahead of time is what we call inoculation. The more you know about what's going to happen when you go into this, when you walk through the door, because the way the brain works is you can never unsee what you saw and hear what you heard. And so all the things you see when you go into this mass casualty event, they're going to stay with you. So the more you can be prepared for this, you're still going to get traumatized because trauma is contagious. When you respond to somebody else's trauma, it's like, radiation. You take a little bit of that with you.
We talked a little bit with Lieutenant Brian Murphy and his experiences, and he spoke very eloquently to the mental health factor and how in the law enforcement field, sometimes there's a little machismo that may get in the way of people being willing to openly talk about these things they carry with them. So what advice would you have to our friends in law enforcement around that?
Well, one of the things that we started a long time ago is, because you're right, cops are independent. They like to handle things on their own, the machismo. So if, two of you respond to an event and you're struggling and John's not, you're going to feel hesitant to go in and talk to somebody about it. So one of the things—
You're going to feel I'm weak.
Yeah. So
right?
one of the things we recommended is mandatory. That means everybody goes through. So, and you can say, hey, I'm fine, but we got to go talk to this person. And they come in and they open up and they talk and stuff. So it gives you cover. That was one of the biggest things we found.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing we look at too, if you're going to set up a program with mental health, your people you use to work with law enforcement or first responders, three things. They need to be culturally competent. In other words, cops aren't going to go to somebody that doesn't know what a cop does or a firefighter. They need to have that. Then they need to be trauma informed, because when you work with a trauma, it's different than general counseling. And then they need to have credibility. So if you get all three of those, then
The other thing that Brian talked to us about was the importance of, you were talking about stovepiping in the threat assessment process, not stovepiping in the mental health piece. That, let's say you do get shot, right, and you may not be able to be on the force anymore based on your injury. What are the impacts that occur with that family of that officer as well? So he was advising, let's be a little bit more broader than just the individual who may have been directly involved, but
yeah, you have what we call the medical footprint. That's the number of folks killed or injured or directly involved. Then you have the psychological. That are the number of folks, family members or whoever, that are traumatized by the event. Yeah.
I've had the opportunity to work with you around the country, and one of the lessons that I've learned from you is your theory of too much, too ugly, and shattered assumptions. Can you talk about both of those?
Yeah, one of the things we do now is first thing when we're working with somebody is we look at how the person got contaminated. And what we found is there's 4 ways you can get contaminated with trauma. And they all start out with what John says, too much, too ugly. First one is too much, too ugly, too soon. That's where you're literally involved in an officer-involved shooting or terrorist attack or a fire or something like that. All this information is coming in the brain. Then the other one is too much, too ugly, too long. We'll see that for like individuals, officers who are assigned to child sexual assault or homicides of children and stuff, too many dead babies and stuff. The brain reaches circular and can't deal with it anymore. Then there's one, too much, too ugly, too similar. That's where you respond to this event. And it's, you respond to the Aurora Theater shooting, but you're also on Columbine. Too similar. Or it's similar to something, you respond to the kids that were, choked and put in oil bins up north, and you have daughters the same age. Once it becomes personalized, then the other is too much, too ugly, too different. That's where you respond to an event, and the brain has no way of kind of making sense out of it, and you can't put it in there. So that's the first level we look at. Then what John's talking about is shattered assumptions. It's an interesting thing. We all have assumptions of how the world's supposed to operate. Then one day the assumptions get shattered. And we don't know what our assumptions are until they get shattered. Then when your assumptions get shattered, you got to figure out, how do I rebuild it? So an assumption parents have is that, when I send my little ones to school, they'll come back alive. But people know about Columbine and STEM and all these, and little ones never came back. So how do you carry on? There's different ways the brain can operate. One is you can do meltdown, which is not the healthiest one, and that's where you're just totally anxious, totally fearful. The other is what we call avoidance. You homeschool it, or, working with some of the survivors at the Aurora Theater shooting, talking to them. There are some folks who said, I'm never going back to a movie theater again. And, we just passed the, 8-year anniversary, and they've never been back. And then there's kind of the best one, which is new normal. That's where, for parents to feel comfortable sending to their kids to school, they need to look at, are there SROs? Do they have a threat assessment team? Do they have an active shooter protocol? What's the safety procedures? Or when you go to a movie theater, you look around, see where the exits are. So that's what we want to achieve, is a new normal after our shattered assumptions.
Now, speaking of new normals, the mood of the nation right now, the anger and divisiveness, the aggressiveness that we're seeing, just on a personal note, is this a new normal? We're seeing something that's at least unparalleled in the last 50 years. How do we help kids, maybe even parents, make sense of this?
Okay, and I kind of come from a different perspective where, everybody's talking about a new normal. The way I look at it is I call it a new abnormal.
I like that.
Where we're at right now is dysfunctional. So do we try and adapt to the dysfunction, assuming it's going to stay like that? That we're always going to have tribes, that we're always going to have to watch what we say, there's always going to be, I hope not, but you may have to adapt to a dysfunctional world.
That's a new abnormal. That's a really good.
I know it's not politically correct, but that's kind of what I'm saying.
It's true, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Let's talk a little bit about the implications of the pandemic itself. We talked a little bit here about the different factions, right, and the violence that we're seeing on our streets in some cases. The pandemic itself has had a collective impact, I think, on the new abnormal. In our last podcast, we talked about the fact that most often in crisis events, you're responding for 10 seconds, 10 minutes, 10 days, but this is just going on longer and longer and longer. So it's not like we got to the end of it, now we're in the recovery phase.
Yeah, there's no, it's not a recovery. You think you do, then all of a sudden you get slapped back. So the pandemic is just a word for a series of events. So what we look at with the pandemic is, okay, what do we have to do to stay safe? And then you have these different events like quarantine. And so what happens, some of the things that, governments had to choose winners and losers, who are essential workers and who are not. And by doing that, some folks were able to survive. Some folks weren't able to survive because of their, occupation. And how do you then, that creates a whole new series of problems. We don't have money. What are we going to do? And stuff like that. So it's kind of looking at where you're at with each of these events. And we also saw, like with first responders, they're essential workers, so they were out there. Their partner may have been quarantined, and the kids were quarantined. So now you're out there, you're being exposed. What we saw is family pressure where, do you have COVID? Are you bringing it home to us? And shouldn't you be quarantined and not coming home? And creates all these different challenges for families.
So I know we talked about some pre-event behaviors, some threat assessment kind of work, and some trauma impact during events, right? If we're responding to an event. Do you have any advice around the recovery phase from any of these things? Like, how do you start the process of recovery? I know you've gone into a couple of schools to help with specific events and start by processing with them. But other advice you have around reclaiming your community or your school? I know we talked with Frank DeAngelis about that a little bit when we had a chance to see him.
We've adopted Dr. Nicoletti's model that law enforcement and fire departments use, which is a debriefing process. The first time we used that was when one of our students set himself on fire in front of 200 classmates. And we needed help, obviously, making sense for all of the staff to find a way for them to get back to a level where they could continue to teach. But we needed someone to help us process, what did we just go through? And that debrief process, I found, was incredibly powerful. Now, after every significant event we have in the district, we bring Dr. Nicoletti's team in to help us debrief as a step one.
Yeah, and the purpose of a debrief, what we want to do with trauma, so you can carry on, is we want to move the traumatic event from the conscious part of our brain to the memory center. And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, so trauma is part of the stress continuum from the standpoint that it's contagious, but they go in different directions in terms of how do you mitigate it. General stress, you can go to the gym and lift, you can go play golf, you can do tons of stuff. None of that will get your trauma to the memory center. So the only way we can really get it to the memory center, there are only 3, and usually 2 just work with adults. Talking about it, writing about it, and with kids we can have them draw and paint and stuff like that. And a debrief is a talking about it. It gets it there, and the person begins to kind of make sense out of what just happened and put it in place and stuff like that.
Nice.
Writing can get it there. It's a little slower, and it's literally writing. And one of the things we tell people is if you're doing trauma writing, don't read it, because if you read it, you just put the ghost
Redo
back
it
in.
again, right?
Yeah.
It seems like that debrief process would be a good way to get a handle on what that footprint is you were talking about earlier for the group that you're trying to support.
Yeah, and it helps people get closure because, 3 people respond to an event. You have tunnel vision. You're just here. Somebody's over here. Then afterwards, I didn't realize you were there. I didn't realize this was going down. Plus, you get to hear that you're not the only one going through this and stuff like that.
I think if I could advise any school district out there in terms of recovery, it would be that a debrief process with trained trauma psychologists should be the first step in everybody's plan for recovery, because that sets the table for all the adults, and then you move from there with the kids. But you've got to get your people into a position where they can return to work, and they can continue on. And until you do that, what you get then is you get people that they get upset, right? They don't know what you went through, but they get frustrated, and you hear little bits of information, not all of it, and then rumors start, and then people start talking about, well, you're acting kind of squirrely and you weren't even around it. But you don't know what everybody's trauma is.
Sure.
So that process also, from what I've seen, brings people closer together. We've done it after suicides. We brought Dr. Nicoletti in to talk to staff after student suicide, and he was able to help them get to a point where they could go back to the class and then help the students through the rest of the day. And that's incredibly important.
And part of the debriefing process is education, because most people don't understand trauma. The two, what I call the deadly duo in trauma, are intrusions and flashbacks. Intrusions can be cognitive, where you just keep thinking about it. It could be visual, where you keep seeing it. You keep seeing the child burning, or it could be smells and stuff like that. Then flashbacks are where you're fine, but something happens and it wakes up the ghosts. And John brought up a good point. You'll have some people who they weren't there, but they're having a hard time. What people don't realize is when you move the trauma from the conscious part of your brain to the memory center, it goes to a specific part of the brain. I call it the Book of the Dead. And the more traumas you have, the more chapters you have in the Book of the Dead. And so you may have this event, and you put this other trauma in the Book of the Dead, but this event wakes up that ghost. And that's why you have somebody kind of struggling when they weren't there. And people say, why you weren't even there? It woke up this ghost. Then we see streaming once in a while where it wakes up several chapters, and that becomes real problematic.
I've heard, John, you also advise that executive leadership teams in districts need to be open to and self-aware enough to say, we may be too close to this and need somebody to help guide us through what's the next step.
Wow.
Because they re-traumatize themselves over and over and over and start talking about that loop. Well, I was there, or I used to work at that school, or I knew that kid, or I knew, and then they don't help move the system forward.
If you're too contaminated, you're not going to be helpful.
I responded to a national level tragedy, and the executive leadership team just couldn't stop looping with each other, and it lasted for several days, and my recommendation to them was bring in a facilitator. Actually, it was bring in Dr. Nicoletti to help you facilitate the crisis management and get through the next 2 weeks, right? And I liken it, I call it my fives. It's that 5 minute, it's the 5 hour, it's the 5 day. Most tragedies are going to be done by that time, but sometimes they last for 5 weeks in the COVID world. We don't know when it'll ever end. But if you're looping, then you're not making decisions. And if all you can do is talk about what you went through and where you're at today, then your leadership team isn't focusing on downstream to the really important group that we got to get back, which is our kids and our teachers in the school setting.
Yeah, start with putting it. If you're the leader, if you die, your employees die.
And that goes back to our saying of check your ego at the door, right? We're not always that. We're not always the one. We have to understand that when things get bigger than we can handle or we know how to manage, bring in the experts and raise your hand for help, because there's a lot of it out there. And one of the questions I always get is, where do we go? Who do we even talk to? Or who can help us? And hey, call, we will help. The Jeffco DeAngelis Foundation, the mere nature of it is all about providing a resource and reaching out and connecting people.
Yeah, a good example going back to '99 is, when Columbine came down, you had good folks who were counselors and stuff, but they were contaminated too. And so they're trying to help, but they're dealing with their own issues.
Yeah, and that's a challenge too, right? When an event happens, sometimes you get more help than is helpful. Everybody wants to be a part of helping, right?
Well, that's what happened with Columbine. When we moved everybody to Leawood, Channel 9 or one of the TV stations says, all mental health people, please come down to Leawood. And we had all these people come down, well-meaning, but they never worked trauma. And, if you've never worked trauma and you go to a family and they're sitting there and their child is lost or possibly deceased, you ever wonder what you're supposed to say? A lot of them would start out because they thought they were doing a debrief, and they'd say, how are you doing? You never ask someone in trauma, how are you doing?
Yeah.
You know, that was probably one of the biggest lessons, I think, for everybody when they moved from Columbine to Leawood, and Leawood became the reunification center. They brought the SWAT team to Leawood. They brought the crisis mental health people to Leawood. It's a little bitty school with 200 kids. Everybody's in the same space, including the parents and kids that have just been traumatized in the school. And now they're all looking at each other, and nobody's managing the process.
Well, and then the crowd gets smaller,
Right.
smaller.
Know what's going on, and nobody's giving you an answer because it's always up to the medical examiner to give the feedback. So one of the things, kind of following what John says, you know how every event has an incident commander from a tactical. We recommend you should have a psychological incident commander.
Excellent.
That person's there to say, tap out, hey, you're too close, we're tapping you out.
Yeah, outstanding. So we're about to come to a close, but I want to give both of you the opportunity to bring up anything else that you'd like our listeners to hear, current things that are coming up in the field, work that you're currently doing that you want to be sure to mention before we close.
I think you covered a lot of stuff. One of the things that I'd like to close with is, you know, these events, they're tragic. They have huge medical and psychological footprint, but everything starts out as a situational adjustment. You know, this is an event, but if you don't do anything like post-traumatic stress, if you don't treat it, then we add another word, and whenever this word gets added, then we got a problem. That word is disorder. You don't want post-traumatic stress to become post-traumatic stress disorder. You don't want a panic attack to become a panic disorder. As soon as that word gets activated, now we're dealing with a little more problems.
I would just say find the Dr. Nicolettis in your world, because you're going to need them to help you recover and win back your community.
And that's what John's saying that's the definition of resiliency. Going back to Darwin, survival of the fittest doesn't go to the smartest or the strongest, it goes to the species that adapts the quickest. So you need to, instead of saying, I should be able to handle this on my own, you need to say, I'm going to do whatever it takes.
Very empowering. Very empowering. Well, thank you again, Dr. Nicoletti and Mr. McDonald, for your time today and for your daily commitment to supporting police, public safety, our schools and communities. We certainly are lucky to have the opportunity to learn from the expertise and experience that you both bring. This conversation has been brought to you by the Jeffco DeAngelis Foundation. More information about the foundation can be found at deangeliscenter.org.